going to be talking a little bit about the repatriation work that is going on at the National Museum of the American Indian at the Smithsonian. And so I'm going to kind of talk about the present and then sort of move back in time to some of the earlier debates there at the museum. And that's kind of unusual for me because I'm a historian, so it'll be fun. For American Indians in the United States, the concept of repatriation has very specific legal meanings that refer to the returning of cultural objects or human remains to their proper place. American Indian tribal nations and their citizens have been involved in a long effort to have their significant cultural objects, many of them sacred objects, returned to them. The struggle over human remains and a respectful burial with proper ceremonies is another significant part of the repatriation issues. American Indians lobbied for decades and decades for this fundamental human right. Unethical practices of past decades and centuries are primarily the reason for the repatriation laws of the United States and the corresponding policies that exist across many kinds of institutions today. This federal legislation, often known as NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990, was a watershed moment in the repatriation struggle of American Indians. And it really followed a national dialogue on the subject. The law required thousands of museums, universities, and other institutions, including the University of Minnesota and the Minnesota Historical Society. It required institutions like this that receive federal funds and grants to inform federally recognized tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations across the U.S. about the objects in their collections. So this process included informing tribes about the human remains in their collections. When American Indians and Native Hawaiian organizations requested objects or human remains for return, a consultative and research process proceeded, one that involved dialogue with Native Americans. Sacred objects and cultural patrimony essential to contemporary religious life needed to be returned to tribes. And in the case of human remains and associated funerary objects, the transfer went to, in most cases and whenever possible, lineal descendants. In cases where no lineal descendants could be ascertained, a respectful transfer was made to the closest culturally affiliated tribe. My whole talk is not going to sound like this. But I wanted to kind of point out the history of this law, the specific kind of legal meanings of the term repatriation for American Indians. And also to point out that this is extraordinarily complicated work. And when you think of, we've been talking about here in Minnesota how we have Ojibwe people up north and we have Dakota people down south. But remember that there are, I think the recent count is 573 federally recognized tribes in the United States. And those tribes are not the same, nor do they have the same cultural ideas about human remains, right? And so this is often very complicated work. So for the past 6 years, I've been a member of the Board of Trustees of the National Museum of the American Indian at the Smithsonian. And during that entire time, the past 6 years, I've been a member of the Repatriation Committee. And I also chair another committee at the museum, which is the Scholarship and Collections Committee. I really consider this work to be one of the great privileges of my career, of my life. It's also a huge responsibility given our vast collection. As many of you know, the National Museum of the American Indian at the Smithsonian is actually two museums. There is one in DC on the National Mall that has a very interesting architectural style. That museum opened fairly recently in 2004. And the other one is in New York and has a very different sort of, look to it. Not a native architect of this building like the other. And then there's also the collections, which is out in a facility in suburban Maryland, where the collection is being maintained under, in a new facility under ideal conditions. The National Museum of the American Indian at the Smithsonian, the new museum on the Mall, and the storage facility out in Suitland, Maryland, was built because of this amazing collection. So I talk about being chair of the Scholarship and Collections Committee. We have at the museum 800,000 catalog entries alone. So that is sometimes multiple items, objects in every catalog entry. I think there's something like 125,000 photographs in the collection. And sometimes it's just an amazing thing to go out into Suitland and to look at the collections there. I know when the museum was being constructed and hadn't opened yet on the Mall, I remember being out in Suitland in the storage facility on the day they were bringing in the canoes from New York City on the loading dock. And it was just like an incredible thing to see. And when we go look at the photograph collections, they'll have like the original glass slides from Edward Curtis, right? So it's just like an amazing, amazing collection. Most of the collection, we do have new things, but we also, most of this 800,000 catalog entries and all these objects were amassed at the turn of the century by an obsessive New York collector, George Gustav High. The collection is vast, but it also is problematic in areas, considering the collecting practices of the day, right, during High's lifetime and the time when new departments of anthropology were being developed in the United States. So the NMAI, as part of the Smithsonian, now the problem was High was this wealthy New York collector, but even his wealth alone couldn't maintain everything after his death, and the collection was actually deteriorating out in New York. So the NMAI, as part of the Smithsonian, sort of rescued this amazing but also deteriorating collection. And so I always like to kind of contrast how this museum came to be, because it's quite different from, like, say, the new African American exhibit in Washington that some of you may have been fortunate enough to visit. When you go visit that museum, it emphasizes kind of storytelling through impressive technology, but they are just now building their collection, right? So contrast this with, it's not like they don't have some amazing things, because some amazing things have been donated, but this is quite different from, the NMAI that's built on this, around this amazing collection. So I want to talk a little bit today about debates over repatriation at the NMAI. And as I do so, I kind of do so from the perspective of a trustee and a member of this committee, but also as an Ojibwe person from a Red Lake Ojibwe community in northern Minnesota. And I should also say that my own parents were activists on repatriation issues when I was growing up, just as countless everyday American Indians have been over the years, especially in the years before NAGPRA. So when I was a kid, my parents worked on especially land issues around repatriation, but we didn't have a word for it. We didn't call it repatriation and so forth. But it was a kind of interesting form of activism. And I knew other Indians who did this kind of work. I had a friend, my mother actually had a friend in the state of Iowa who was Dakota, and she happened to be married to a construction engineer who worked for the Department of Transportation. And they were, road building, they were always running into, into burial sites and so forth. And she herself, in the back of her pickup truck, would return American Indian human remains to places in South Dakota and contemporary communities for their descendants. So before NAGPRA, there was all this work being done by Native people, even though sometimes museums have said Indians weren't interested in this issue. You know, we got to keep everything we have. But that's not true. Policies and practices have evolved over the course of NMAI's history, and today there are very few human remains in the collection. So all of that work of returning human remains was done well before I came on the board. That's not to say that there aren't a few issues that still emerge. We have interesting things in our collections like shirts, Plains Indian shirts that have human hair, and that's human remains, right? But it's not the kind of, thing that we're talking about with like our colleague in Washington that was having to, take the full skeletons of people back to places in South Dakota. But the NMAI regards the return of human remains as the highest priority within the repatriation work, and this work has taken place regardless of geography and social political borders. Now, when I came on the board 6 years ago, I was immediately involved in our current, rewriting our current repatriation policy. And this was sort of a daunting thing for me because, you know how you come onto a new board, you're going to have to learn how things work and what the culture is like and so one of my first meetings, not my first meeting, but I remember I came on the board, I think February is my first meeting, and like by July or August, the repatriation committee was called together and we went to DC for a few days to rewrite the repatriation policy. And I thought, oh my gosh, how am I ever going to take part in this conversation? It was so daunting to me. And then I realized I was super opinionated about it after I was there a couple days, of course. Those of us involved with repatriation, that is the committee, the board, who is the ultimate decision maker about repatriation cases, and then the staff as well, always point out that despite the policies we write, right? You've got the NAGPRA, and then you have all these institutions that have rewritten their own or written their own repatriation policies. None of those policies are really ever adequate in dealing with repatriation issues. And I'll just mention real briefly, just because it popped into my head, how I've been also a member of the board, not currently, but did many terms, several terms as a member of the Minnesota Historical Society's board. And I was completely unaware until we were getting ready to develop the exhibit in relationship to the 150th anniversary of the Dakota War that we had a noose from the hanging at Mankato in our collection, right? So that was shocking and incredibly disturbing to me because I'd been, I didn't know that very problematic, complex piece of history was in our collection. And I remember going to the board of our board meeting, and everyone's pouring over the documents trying to find what the solution is. And I said, there's nothing in our policy that is going to help us better understand this problem that we have right now with the history of this noose. Anyway, that's Minnesota. Yeah, it's still in the collection. So because of the complexity of these issues, and because every object has a story and a complex history, and we consult with tribes and we do extensive research, we always end up saying that we make our decisions about repatriation on a case-by-case basis. We say that again and again and again as we're debating and talking about repatriation issues. I would also say it's the only committee I've ever been on where I have seen every member cry, including the director of the museum. And we have some pretty emotional conversations. We don't sound like a room full of lawyers and bureaucrats as we talk about repatriation issues, even though we have lawyers and bureaucrats on the board. Now, there has been, with the establishment of the new museum, a mandate. I can't remember how it's actually worded, but the majority of members of the Board of Trustees now of the National Museum of the American Indian, which includes, it includes the NMAI in New York, the Suitland collections in the museum in Washington, they have to be American indigenous people, whether to the United States, Canada, or to the Americas, as our collections are hemispheric at the NMAI. The department head of repatriation is American Indian, Comanche person, woman from Oklahoma, and many of the staff are as well. And of the current Board of Trustees that ultimately votes on these issues, only 5 of them are non-Indian people. So by far the majority of the members of the Board of Trustees today are American Indian. And the other folks on the board are very interesting people. And, you know, since I've been on the board, we've always had like a former US Senator, for example, on the board. As we rewrote the repatriation policy after I joined the board, we talked about not just correcting historical injustices, but the emphasis, and this is kind of what I found myself talking a lot about, was Native futures, our futures as Native people. How do we make repatriation meaningful to our people today and in the future? How can repatriation support Indian people, especially as we work today to preserve and revitalize our languages and cultures? And I'll give you just a couple of examples of repatriation topics or things that we repatriated kind of in recent years, just to give an example, because I realize even though we have like an annual report to Congress and so forth, and this work becomes part of the record, it isn't, it's still the case that this work isn't often widely known outside of the museum. Of how repatriation has been going at the National Museum of the American Indians. But I'll tell you one story. And I asked the staff person, you know, to give, it's okay to give these examples, even though one of them isn't, the decision has been made, but it's not in the official records yet. But she said, go ahead, talk about them. So a couple years ago, we had a case with a tribe in California that asked for the return of hats in their collection. And if you've been in museums to see the California indigenous basketry that's done, it's really quite amazing and beautiful, remarkable. And sometimes you see these as baskets, but there also are kind of cone-shaped hats that California Indian people have as part of their culture. And when we looked at this collection of hats that was being requested by the tribe in California, some of the items were identified as work caps, and some of them were not. But all of these items that were being requested by the tribe, for the tribe in California, and I think there maybe were about 14 requests that were made by the tribe, the hats were never used in ceremonies. So under the kind of early definitions of what is a sacred object, these objects probably would never be returned, and requests wouldn't have been successful. But the tribe made an argument that even though they hadn't in the past been used as sacred objects, they had the potential to be used in ceremonies today. And so we had just rewritten this repatriation policy. How are we to say what's sacred, right? They are the expert on what is sacred in their communities. And we felt like if we're thinking about Native futures and the possibility of these caps in the collection being used, even though they had never been used in this way before, if they had the potential to be used in ceremonies for the well-being of Indian people and Native futures, let's go ahead and repatriate them. So we had a really interesting conversation on the board about the repatriation of those hats. We repatriated most of them, and I think there are a few that remained in the collection. There was another case involving a California tribe where we had in our collection an incredible skirt, maybe you'd call it an apron, that was used in ceremonies. And I've seen the object, and it's just stunning. It's rows and rows of shells and intricate sewing and feather work. It's just an incredible piece. So in this case, the tribe knew it was in the collection, came to visit it, and they wanted to use it in ceremonies back home where it would be worn by a young girl, usually about a young girl about the age of 13, 14. And so what the result was, they felt like they didn't have the conditions that were perfect for maintaining it, like the NMAI did. And so that skirt goes to the California tribe every year. And then it goes back into the collection for storage, and we take perfect care of it, right, and consider them the owners. But that's the way the relationship has evolved. We think of repatriation as a collaborative relationship with Indigenous people, and so we encourage what my colleague Sven Hawkinson calls intellectual repatriations. We continuously have tribal people visiting the museum, interacting with the collections that are their cultural heritage. And so sometimes masks need to be cared for in the proper way, and people come in and interact with them. Sometimes fans need to be danced, and people come in and make use of the objects in our collections. I'll mention a case from the Great Lakes that is not finalized yet, but we considered kind of a problematic case of a descendant, an Ojibwe man from Wisconsin. So you can make a request for something to be repatriated as an American Indian tribe, but you can also request it as an individual request, a descendant. And there was an Ojibwe man from Wisconsin who asked for the return of a ceremonial drum. And this drum had been in the collection since about the time of the First World War, around 1918, 1920. And it was the kind of drum used in ceremonies like here in Wisconsin at Mille Lacs, and ceremonies of the big drum in Wisconsin and in Minnesota. Repatriations take a long time because there's extensive research that's done, consultation. We look at, the staff looks at the provenance of the objects, and there's like a little mini book written about every object being considered for repatriation. But this man talked about the fact that this drum, he believed, had been stolen from their community. And we believed him. And we thought he is the person who has the greatest expertise on this drum. So the drum, we already voted that the drum will eventually be returned to him, but there's still some work being done. Now, in the interim, there were beads and things that had fallen off the drum. And we sort of asked as a committee, well, what happens in these cases? What do you do when things fall off the objects while they are, kind of resting in the collection? And the curators say that, they just leave them there. They don't try to repair things. They just sort of leave them as they are. And so the arrangement that we worked out with this man in Wisconsin is that we're going to return these objects that have come loose and away from the drum, return them to him, because he can, with those beads and pieces of sinew and so forth, reconstruct a new drum to be used in the ceremonies in the interim before that drum is returned. When the museum was founded and the repatriation work began, the work was very much, as I said, about the return of problematic objects in our collections. Funerary objects, sacred material. That work was about historical injustices of the past. And the early trustees, I'm going to show you a picture of some of the early trustees, inherited the problem of human remains as they developed new policies and practices. They did so in a climate that was not always sympathetic to the idea of repatriation, or even incorporating Native knowledge into the larger museum world. This climate existed even on the board, which was not at that time. There were very few American Indians on the early board. And so it was kind of slowly evolving that American Indians would be trustees. And I want to kind of close with a long letter I'm going to talk about a few pieces of, written by one of the early members of the Board of Trustees. And even though, in some sense, when I read his letter, it seems like so long ago, but Vine Deloria Jr., who was then a member of the Board of Trustees, wrote this letter around 1990. And to me, that seems so recent, but when I read it, I think, how much has changed. And there has been really a kind of radical rethinking of repatriation in recent decades. But at the time Vine Deloria Jr. was a member of the Board of Trustees, most of the board were wealthy New York art collectors. And so that's the context in which he writes this letter to his other fellow members of the Board of Trustees. Apparently, there had been a meeting in which many board members described their skepticism, objections, and fears about the collection in this new era of NAGPRA. As you know, Deloria was great at satire, and so he wouldn't write an ordinary letter to his colleagues. And he prefaced this letter, and this is from the records of the Board of Trustees, right? 28 years ago, by saying he needed his colleagues' advice on how to proceed with a repatriation problem. He writes, "At the end of the last meeting, I was called back into the meeting room by a cleaning lady. She handed me a marine green hat, quasi-marine green hat, with red and dark green plaid stripes running through it, manufactured by Locke and Company, Hatters, St. James Street, London. 100% wool. It had been left by someone attending the board meeting. I went downstairs to try and find the owner, but everyone had left. Acting as a trustee for the museum, I took the hat home, and it is in my possession. I'll bring it to the next board meeting in June for possible repatriation to its owner. The hat does, however, provide us with an opportunity to test both our repatriation policy and our unexamined assumptions which underlay many of our complaints about dealing with repatriation. I will review them to refresh our minds." So he goes on. He talks about, in this section, the idea of kind of present ownership, right, which he's already kind of laying out. "I've acquired this hat in a peculiar way. I do not have title to it, but it has fallen into my possession. Since it is a classic example of the white man's culture, circa 1990, it is irreplaceable as an art object, and therefore I do not think there would be any circumstances in which the museum should return it." And so I love even how in this first paragraph, Deloria's introducing ideas of right of possession, title, this idea of an irreplaceable cultural object. In the next section, he considered the paradigm shift that now with NAGPRA, native expertise, was going to be considered equal to that of scholars and museum professionals. Just as we know, all Indian curators, historians, and tribal religious leaders deliberately represent the case in order to take artifacts from our museum, so we know that all white scholars, hat makers, and religious leaders will lie their asses off to get this valuable hat returned to them. Therefore, only the word of the Indian scholars and board members will be given credibility when considering repatriation of this hat. Deloria also addressed an issue debated in the early days of repatriation, right, 1990. What if there are multiple claimants? How will we deal with that? Quote, "We could expect that some white man will appear at the board meeting and ask for his hat. Dare we give him the hat? Are there not other white men who would have a valid claim to it? What about his possible relatives, the person who gave him the hat, and other white men who hold this hat in deep reverence because of religious, commercial, social, or political concerns? How can we sort out which white man or group of white men actually deserves to have this hat returned? Another early objection to repatriation was a loss of information to science and research, and Deloria, of course, thought of this too in relationship to the white man's hat. Quote, "Technology is improving all the time, and each day we devise new ways to test hats and derive new knowledge. Can we deprive future generations of scholars, Indians and non-Indians, of the right to use this hat in their studies? Would not future generations of white men be furious with us that we repatriated this hat?" There were a lot of objections in the early days of repatriation about what might happen to objects after they were returned to communities. Usually, this involved very paternalistic language. Deloria mentioned this too in the last part of his, I think, very brilliant letter, which is called "Future Care and Future Sale of the Hat." Quote, "We have acquired this hat primarily because its owner did not exercise sufficient care of the object to retain possession of it. He did not ensure that it was protected from others and carelessly left it lying around in an empty public meeting room. Would he exercise better care of the hat if we returned it, or would he continue in his wasteful, civilized ways and leave the hat at other public places at some time in the future? I greatly fear that if we return this hat, the individual might well be tempted to sell it to a collector, and thus depriving generations of Indian scholars and museum keepers from studying it. What protections would we, as the trustees of the museum, have against such a resale if we returned the hat?" Early repatriation objections also used an argument that museums must preserve objects for the greater public good, and American Indians would not know what to do. That was my favorite one. Indians wouldn't know what to do with their cultural patrimony once it was returned to them. This is his last bit. After all, exactly who is collecting classic art of the late white man culture of the 1990s? Only Indians are preserving the artifacts of contemporary white man culture and life. You don't see white men taking care of their cultural products. Indeed, when they finish using something, they merely throw it away or give it to Goodwill. What will white men know of their culture a century from now? Well, the repatriation staff and I enjoyed reading and discussing this letter of Vine Deloria's, which is not published anywhere. It's just a pretty awesome document within the records of our committee on the Board of Trustees. So on Wednesday, I should have put that up while reading it because that's one of my favorite pictures of him. On Wednesday, I'm headed out to another board meeting at the NMEI to take part in another great conversation about repatriation with my colleagues. Some of them are here in this picture, in front of this very cool contemporary art. Not everything we have at the museum is old. We're collecting contemporary things as well. But I expect to take part in another great conversation about repatriation with my colleagues. So I can't wait. Miigwech, thank you.